Hello and welcome to the podcast from Le Monde Diplomatique. My name is George Miller, and in this programme I'm talking to journalist Lena Bjurström about how, over the past 2 decades, Australia has dealt with asylum seekers who attempted to reach the country clandestinely. These were mainly people from the Middle East and Afghanistan, hoping to start a better life in Australia.
There was this whole idea that Australia was a peaceful country and that you could start a business and get a new life in 6 months, whereas Europe already had this terrible reputation on how we treat our own refugees.
In the early 2000s, Australia's right-wing government faced the challenge of a growing number of clandestine arrivals brought in by boat by people smugglers. By 2013, policy decisions by successive governments had led to a regime of so-called offshore processing, de facto detention camps in Papua New Guinea and the tiny Micronesian island of Nauru. When Médecins Sans Frontières were forced to suspend their work in the Nauru camp last autumn, they said that mental health suffering on Nauru is among the worst MSF has ever seen. Their December 2018 report was entitled Indefinite Despair. When I spoke to Lena on the phone recently, I began by asking her to sketch in some background from the early 2000s.
At the time, the arrivals by boat were a huge problem for Australia because thousands of people would go to Indonesia and take small boats to try to reach the mainland. The Conservative government at the time decided to implement what they called the Pacific solution, to deter the asylum seeker to take the risk of this dangerous trip by boat. Well, at least it was the official aim, and the idea was as well to tackle smugglers' networks. And in many ways, it kind of worked. So at the time, they made agreements with third countries, as the small island of Nauru and Papua New Guinea, to implement centers for processing for people trying to reach Australia by boat. And so people were intercepted by the Australian Navy and sent to Nauru and Papua New Guinea for a time to process their claim to the refugee status. And what is important to note is that it was only a temporary detention at the time, and it definitely changed when the policy was re-implemented in 2012.
So the original policy was that it was theoretically possible for some of these people to be admitted to Australia as asylum seekers. It wasn't simply that they would be detained and then sent back somewhere. It was at least the idea that some of them would, after they'd had their claim processed, that they might gain entry to Australia.
Yes, the idea was to deter and to add an obstacle to the journey to get the refugee status in Australia. But it wasn't pure and simple, no, you won't get the refugee status in Australia. And a lot of them got it, actually. Of course, at the time, the Australian government was hoping that putting people in third countries, they would be encouraged as well to go back to their countries if they saw that it would be really difficult for them to get the refugee status. But lots of asylum seekers actually got the refugee status and went to Australia afterwards.
Now, a Labour government in 2008 in Australia decides to end this regime of the camps, these detention centres. Was that in response to public opinion, or was it because there was less perceived need for the camps, or what was the motivation of the Labour government changing the policy?
I guess there were several motivations. Of course, there were fewer claims and fewer boats arriving, so the need was less important. But the public opinion must have been quite important in their motivations, because first, the human rights organization accused Australia of attempting to circumvent the international law and the principle of not expelling refugees, which is in the 1955 Refugee Convention. So it was quite a huge accusation. But I guess what changed a lot of things is actually money, because it seems money drives the world. There was this report from Oxfam showing that this offshore processing policy cost a lot, actually much more than processing the claims of the asylum seeker in Australia, in the mainland. And this accusation of using taxpayers' money did play a great deal in the motivations of the politicians at the time.
So, having emptied the camps, the Labour government then reverses its policy and it begins to reopen them. Again, I presume in response to an increase in the number of people trying to reach Australia.
Yes, of course there was an increase. I mean, maybe because they shut down the Pacific solution, it played a role in the increase of the boat arrivals. But what we have to remember is that at the time there was a Syrian crisis and then the Rohingya crisis. I mean, there are a lot of other war and crises which can explain why there were more arrivals by boat and more people seeking to get protection in Australia. But responding to this new spike in the clandestine arrivals, so they re-implemented the policy. They changed the name, but it was basically the same. And what changed at the time is that they decided to show zero tolerance to illegal or clandestine arrivals in Australia, saying that any asylum seeker who was trying to reach Australia's shore illegally would never get a chance to get the refugee status in Australia. And taking this decision, they started a vicious circle, because you can say to someone, yeah, you can get the refugee status, but you'll never get to Australia with this refugee status. You start to pile up people in the camps, and they have nowhere to go, and they're there for an indefinite time.
In her article, Lena tells the story of one Syrian man, Abdullah Zalghanah, who found himself caught up in Australia's system of offshoring refugees.
Abdullah was a baker and a cook in Deraa in Syria, living with his wife and his 4 children. When the war broke, they decided to flee to Lebanon. Well, Abdullah said that he couldn't imagine to stay there because of the consequences of the war, because of Bashar al-Assad's militias tracking Syrian refugees in Lebanon. And so he decided to leave his family and to go for a quest, for a place for his children to grow up in peace.
And Australia seemed like a good option to him at that time.
It was not his main idea at the beginning. He started to go to Egypt. And that's in Egypt, going around with the Syrian community, that he heard about Australia. And the word was at the time that Australia was a better bet than Europe to get a refugee status. There was this whole idea that Australia was a peaceful country and that you could start a business and get a new life in 6 months. Whereas Europe already had this terrible reputation on how we treat our own refugees.
So in order to try to gain access to Australia, he fell in with some people smuggling networks who were operating out of Indonesia.
Yes, well, he got in touch with Syrian people in Egypt, and through them, he got in touch with the smugglers network. I don't have a lot of details on this part because he wouldn't say a lot. Of course, I guess he may be afraid of the consequences. But so anyway, he paid the network to get first to Malaysia and then from Malaysia to Indonesia, where he stayed for a month in a small hotel and with 71 other people. And one night, people came and said, yeah, we're going, and they reached the coast. And there was this very small boat. they had to take to reach Australia. At the time, they didn't know that people planned to deposit them on Christmas Island, 400 kilometers away. They really believed that they would go directly to Australia. What Abdullah said about this boat is that when he saw it, he couldn't imagine that they would actually cross an ocean with it. And numerous times he thought they would die on the sea, as many others did.
But he did make it to the shores of Christmas Island, where they were all picked up by the Australian Coast Guard, and that's when he was transferred to the camp on Nauru, isn't it?
He was not transferred right away in Nauru. Because he asked to stay in Christmas Island, believing that maybe he would have a chance as a Syrian asylum seeker to get the refugee status. But at the time, it was right at the time where Australia's government decided that people arriving by boat would never get a chance to get the refugee status in Australia. And under pressure, he finally agreed to be deported to Nauru camps.
Give me some sort of sense of both the physical and the psychological conditions for the detainees who were held in the camp, people like Abdullah.
What he describes is that when he arrived in Nauru, the camps were mainly tents, where 40 people would sleep, so with no sense of privacy, only 2 toilets for thousands of people. And what he describes most is that people were all in depression. They got pills to just go through the day, and they spent their days eating pills all the time just to stay alive. And the sense of desperation was so important that a lot of people started to try to take their own life, sometimes as a declaration to show, trying to show the world their situation. One Iranian guy he knew put his body on fire when a delegation of the Australian government came to Nauru.
And these are people who have lost everything, who have risked everything, and yet they have no certainty, they have no knowledge really about when their fate will be decided and how it will be decided and where they will go.
They are in limbo. I guess there's no better words than this, actually. Yes, they have lost everything. And of course, we don't know who they all are, but basically there are people who, as you said, left everything and tried to find a place to live, whatever the background is, and they're treated like criminals just because they were looking for a place to live. It's not understandable to someone who's going through this kind of experience. And well, years after, Abdullah still has a lot of difficulties to talk about that. When I interviewed him and he was telling about the conditions in Nauru, he had to stop at a time and we took a break. He went out in the street to smoke a cigarette, to just think and take the time, because it's still really difficult for him to remember what happened there.
So while he's being held in the detention camp in Nauru, the Australian government is trying to find some permanent solution to its problem, and it looks to Cambodia. And you mentioned that you travelled to Cambodia as part of the story. What is the government trying to achieve by entering into negotiations with Cambodia?
When the Australian government decided that they wouldn't give any chance to the asylum seeker to get protection in Australia, they started a vicious circle. And it seems kind of amazing thinking that they took this decision without any actual solution for people to go, actually, as if they expected that saying that everyone who was detained in Nauru and in Papua New Guinea would say, yeah, well, since it doesn't work, yeah, I will agree to go back to my country. It doesn't work this way. Well, after a time, of course, they did realize that it wouldn't work, and people were piling up in these camps. And so they started to look for a solution because they couldn't politically come back to the initial situation. So they went to Cambodia. From what I heard, there were other attempts with other countries, but Cambodia was the only one who agreed to take money and grant protection to the refugees detained in Nauru. But what was said was it had to be a choice of the refugees, because forcing people detained in Nauru to be settled in Cambodia would be one more breach of the international law. You cannot do that, really. So they passed this agreement with Cambodia, thinking that it may be a solution for the 1,000 people detained in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. Except it didn't work because people didn't want at all to go to Cambodia. Most of them had no idea of what were the conditions in this country, and nothing in the agreement, at least what was shared with the public, explained precisely what the conditions would be. So basically, people were asked to agree to settle in Cambodia, but with no information, as the only way to get out of the hell in Nauru and Papua New Guinea. So just a few people agreed. At first, it was 4 people in 2015. And first, Abdullah didn't want to go. And he only agreed to settle in Cambodia because after a while, he said he got a promise from the Australian authorities that they would act on his behalf to bring his family from Lebanon to Cambodia. What Abdullah said was that he had no idea of what Cambodia was like. He wanted to get out of Nauru, of course, but wherever he could live, he would be okay with it as long as he could be with his family. And that at the time, he didn't see them for 3 years, So it was the most important. So he agreed to be settled in Cambodia.
And did you get a sense from him of how he found it when he got to Cambodia, if he found it difficult to settle there, if he was helped as he'd been promised?
So when he got there, he was hosted by the International Organization of Migration Office in Phnom Penh. He spent a month there. He got lessons, cultural lessons, language lessons, and so from what he said, he got he got a lot of help to settle. After the time the refugees spent in the IOM office, they are asked to develop an economic project. So either find a job or maybe start their own business with some help provided by Australia. And Abdullah was told that when his business would work, he would get news from his family, and once he was definitely settled, his family would come as well. But he didn't say that he had a lot of difficulties to settle in Cambodia. Of course, the language is an issue. Of course, the culture is an issue as well, because he had no idea of what this country was like at the time. But he said he was quite surprised how cosmopolitan Phnom Penh was, and he could get in touch with people to talk, to exchange about his stories. But his main preoccupation then was how he could get reunited with his family. He was worried about how things were going on in Lebanon, not really well, as you know, and it was, he was basically obsessed by it. So he would do anything and would never say a bad thing about his resettlement in Cambodia, because it might endanger his reunion with his family.
And he was eventually reunited with his family, although there was a long delay and he thought it might never happen. His family were eventually flown to Phnom Penh. How would you say they have settled there now? Are they still hopeful of one day returning to Syria, or what do you are they making a new life in Cambodia?
The last I heard from them, first. Just to remember, his family arrived in Phnom Penh last January. So it was more than 2 years after Abdullah settled in Cambodia. When I met him last year, he was starting to think about going on a hunger strike to get attention, to get news from his family, because he spent 2 years without any news from the Australian government and the Australian officers, and he started to think that maybe it was just a joke. So that's why he started to talk to the medias and thinking about a hunger strike. He had to fight to get reunited with his family and to not get lost in the failure of the Australia-Cambodia agreement, because this agreement came to an end last autumn. And he was definitely afraid that maybe, it is a failure, so no one cares anymore, and he would be forgotten in the process.
As you say, the policy has been a failure. It's been terminated. So what fate do you think awaits those who are still detained? What is Australia thinking? What is Australia doing now with those who remain in its offshore detention camps?
So over the last year, there were a lot of alarming reports on the medical situation in Nauru and Manus Island, with a lot of suicidal attempts, and so under the public pressure, the Australian government started to transfer refugees from the camps to Australia's mainland. So it started with the children, and then considering the physical and mental state of the adult refugees, they were forced to transfer adults as well for medical reasons. So now, since it has changed a bit since I wrote this article, but it seems there are around 900, 1,000 people still detained offshore. The others, so around 900 people were transferred to Australia for medical reasons. In the same time, there are an agreement signed with the United States, who agreed to take a few refugees from the camps and to get them settled in the United States. So 500 refugees have now been settled in America. And, we have to note as well that more than 800 people have voluntarily returned to their home countries. So, as you can guess, it's never really voluntarily. It's under pressure, and when you feel that there are no other solutions. For the remaining refugees and asylum seekers in Papua New Guinea and Nauru, I don't really know. I guess at one point they're going to have to find a solution. Maybe they will go on with the transfer in the mainland, but it can take months, it can take years. When you put people far away from the reach of the public opinion, forgotten on islands, the public opinion tend to forget. And I guess what is definitely important now is to remember that, yes, there still are people on these islands, on these camps, and their fate is not clear at all.
And the last thing I wanted to ask you was, you point out in your article that the EU had noted Australia's offshoring policy and had done something quite similar itself by paying Turkey to be a sort of holding repository for refugees rather than allowing them into the EU for processing.
Well, in many ways, Australia has been a precursor in the outsourcing policy in migration and asylum processing. And of course, the European Union got interested in its solution. Australia is not the only one thinking to expand its borders. Basically, what Europe did, as what Australia did, was to move their borders from their territory, for migration issues, to move their borders from their territories to third countries, Turkey, for a time Libya as well. Thinking that maybe it would be, to add an obstacle on the road of the asylum seekers. We cannot say that Europe has taken such drastic measures as Australia because, from what I am aware, they don't have detention camps with people held for indefinite time, as there is in Nauru. And there is not this idea that if you try to come to Europe clandestinely, you will never get access in any way, which is definitely a breach of the international law. So it is the main idea, and of course Europe took inspiration of Australia in this idea to move their borders and to move the process outside of their countries. But the Union hasn't reached the final point Australia reached. There are many steps in outsourcing the migration and asylum policies. Australia has gone very far away in these steps. Maybe Europe is not there yet, and I hope we will never get there. But it is quite interesting to see that people talking the most about Australia's offshore processing is the far right wing of European politicians.
I was talking to Lena Bjurström about her article Australia Offshores Its Refugee Problem, which originally appeared in the April 2019 edition of Le Monde Diplomatique. It's available on the website at mondediplo.com. If you're a subscriber, you can read every edition of the paper going back over 20 years, as well as exploring other resources such as maps, images, the podcast archive, and online exclusive content. And if you're not yet a subscriber, there's plenty of content online to entice you to become one, and full details on how to go about it. In the words of the late John Berger, why read LMD? To make sense of what's happening in the world, behind the misinformation. I hope you'll join me again soon for another interview with one of our contributors. Until then, thank you very much for listening, and goodbye.